Hello everyone. I'll start with Bari. Bari spent 20 years in financial institutions in the corporate world and working with a variety of nonprofit organizations. After that time, where she noticed the need for professional development and coaching to support leaders in building successful high-performance teams. Bari's mission is connecting people with resources to discover what's possible when working together for a shared goal. Since 2012, Bari's focus as an IPAC certified professional coach, facilitator, and strategist is on getting the culture right in business to achieve the success they desire while closing the gaps that exist between the words and the actions. Shannon became an IPAC certified professional coach in 2015 after working in corporate finance roles for nearly a decade at 2 Fortune 500 companies in the hospitality industry. She launched her coaching business, Shannon Claire Coaching, to pursue her passion for developing people. Shannon believes that sustainable change happens from the inside out, and she leads with this coaching philosophy in her work with individuals and teams. Her clients include entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and high-level decision makers at publicly traded companies and rapidly growing startups. Thank you both for being here. We can't wait to see your presentation.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you for that warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So today we're here to present the power of team culture, why it matters, and where it starts.
And we are two coaches on a mission to help companies create and sustain thriving workplaces. In our work with both individuals and organizations, what we've learned is that culture is really the glue that makes or breaks a team or an organization. So we're really excited to be here and share our learnings with you.
So why does culture matter? In a typical environment, we hear about win-wins. And in my experience, or our experience working with clients and just observing the world, I think it's often a triple win. And we talk about organizations are an entity. They need to win. The people that work at this entity need to win. And then there's all the stakeholders like the customers and everybody else that needs to win to create the success that a company desires. And culture is one of those things that is not always talked about when we are talking about an organization and what makes them successful. And in our experience, culture is the one thing that really can make a difference.
So even though we know that culture can offer an organization a significant competitive advantage, in recent research that Gallup conducted, in reality, most people don't feel connected to their organization's culture. As you can see in this graph, only about 21% feel connected to their organization's culture. So we wanted to share this with you because as coaches, we believe that this means there's a big opportunity for us to go into companies and help them both create and shape their culture from the inside out.
So in this presentation, we're specifically focusing on teams because for many of you, this may be the work that you're currently doing or work that you're interested in doing going forward, or perhaps even occasionally you get asked to do it. So the first thing is, what is a team? It's a group of people working within an organization who are working on a shared purpose and a set of goals. Teams can be the C-suite, it can be the C-suite's direct reports, it can be a direct report of a C-suite and their employees, or in general, any group of people that are working together, again, towards a shared purpose and goals.
So for today, we'd like to cover 3 different areas. The first is talking about how a team culture gets defined and created. Then we'll cover what the components of a high-performing culture are. And in this section, we'll also talk a bit about the infamous toxic culture that we all hear about. And then lastly, we will talk about how things can go awry when the dynamics on a team shift, which seems to be the only constant, especially in this world. And to make sure that you get the value that you came to this workshop for, we know that your time is valuable and we really want to maximize the value of it for you. So we're hoping that this workshop can be as interactive as possible. And we wanted to get things rolling with giving you an opportunity to just let us know in the chat which of these three you are most excited to learn about. I see some of the numbers coming in already. So you would put a 1 if you think team culture, how it gets defined and created is important, a 2, a 3, and so forth. And we also welcome combos or other things that you don't see on this slide. So let us know, we'll give you a second to do that. All right, so far I see number 2, the components. The first one, how it gets defined and created, combo, 2 and 3, 1 and 2. Great, so we've got a bit of everything here. And we will have time at the end, we're hoping, that we can move through the content in a way that we have about 5 minutes at the end where you guys can ask questions. And we'll also share our contact info in case you have additional questions at the end. So here we go.
So the first one that we're going to talk about is defining culture. If you wouldn't mind in the chat, in your experience, how do you define team culture? Just throw in a word to that strikes you.
Behaviors that are accepted or not accepted is something that Greg added in the chat.
Anybody else have any words?
As we go through today's content, Greg is hitting on a really important word because culture ultimately shapes behaviors, people's behaviors within an organization. So that is a common thread that we will weave throughout today's talk. I also see values are in the chat, which is great.
Well, I think that those work.
Norms, values, ways of working. Yeah, these are all relevant and applicable. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So in doing our research to put together this presentation, we came across a quote that we liked, and it's Jennifer Chapman at UC Berkeley, and she's, according to Adam Grant, queen of culture. And she defines it as a pattern of beliefs and expectations that members share and that produce norms that powerfully shape how everyone behaves. So in the chat, you guys mentioned values, beliefs, norms, values. Those are all part of it. And the values is a really big piece of it, because without the values, you don't really have a North Star that is going to help you to decide what works and what doesn't work. Some of the other words that I came up with, that I've seen, we came up with in our experience with other teams, the atmosphere of an organization, the trust, the abundance, transparency, authentic, connection, belonging, respect, all of these pieces go into a culture. And one of the things that we know about cultures is they can either be intentional or by default. This quote, "We either live with intention or exist by default," by Kristen Armstrong, very powerful quote, both in our personal lives and in professional lives. We find that many companies don't take the time to do what it takes to really define their culture. And again, if they're not creating the culture, culture will create it itself. It's proven, you can see it. I don't know about all of you, but for me personally, for Shannon and I together, we are so observant and aware of when we walk into any place to do business, looking at those clues and the cues as to what is culture and how it shows up. And it's always a choice. Everything in life is choices. And so as a company, you have the option to be proactive and choosing the intentional culture that you define. And some companies, when we think about it, we talk about what a great company looks like. Some companies choose not to go by the same definition we use as to what a great company looks like, and that's okay. It's what's most important is that you as a company or an organization and as a coach doing this work with organizations is help them to find what they want to be their culture. It's personal, defining success as personal, but helping them to create the culture that they want within their organization. Because again, if they don't do it, the culture will be created itself. One other thing, culture can be viewed through many different lenses. One is noticing what is rewarded and what is punished. That is very telling in a culture.
Definitely. All right, so now that we've talked about defining what a team is and what team culture is, let's talk about those components that make up a healthy, thriving culture. And what we've landed on is these three. They're the ones that we keep coming back to in our work with clients. As you begin your journey with doing culture work, you may come up with multiple other components. It can be challenging to simplify it down into three, but we feel that that helps give the client a really succinct framework through which to look at culture. So let's go through each of these: shared purpose, open communication, and psychological safety, which I saw Shakti's comment about safety to be and do show up as you are with what you have. That definitely plays into that third component. So let's dive right in. So the first component is shared purpose towards a common goal. And what this really does is it helps a team create synergy. When you have that shared purpose, what ends up being able to open up is that team members can move in the same direction together, as you see with these rowers in the picture. And what that helps them do is create momentum more easily and also achieve sustainable results, which is oftentimes one of the biggest business objectives. And then what we talked about a bit is that culture shapes behavior. So how does that show up when you have a shared purpose? Well, team members are willing to recognize that another team member might be overwhelmed or at their capacity. So one of the behaviors that a team member in a healthy culture with a shared purpose would do is help that team member by picking up the slack of what that other team member isn't able to do. So you see people working together, going the extra mile, having that willingness because they're all guided by the same deeper purpose. And purposeful teams also, we find, they tend to be much more agile and better decision makers because there are going to be curveballs. That's inevitable. As we say, change is the only constant. So the teams with the shared purpose seem to be able to bounce back better and have that resiliency in their decision-making abilities. And then we go into open communication. And when we say transparency, what it really means to us is that communication flows in both directions. So team leaders are communicating, they're being heard by the team members, and the opposite is also true. The team leader is just as willing to listen to the team members as they are to give directives. And consistency is also really, really important when it comes to open communication. So an example of this could be, having that set time to meet one-on-one with direct reports every 2 weeks without even having a set business agenda. Just that time to connect and be together. Having that deep connection allows people to feel like there's trust, and then they have the ability to move forward with that deep connection, and clarity also comes from the open communication. Another example could be if you allow time at the beginning of a Zoom meeting. So often we're really quick to jump into the agenda, but how nice would it be for those team members to have some open connection time at the beginning of a Zoom call? That can really help them learn how to communicate well when things are going well, and then apply that open communication when there is a conflict or something that arises. And connection is also, it's a really cool creativity booster because when people are free flow brainstorming, think about how many possibilities they're able to create versus being in tunnel vision and each person working in their silo. When they can communicate, they're not duplicating efforts and they're really able to be more purposeful overall. So we think communication is great, but there is a caveat here. a lot of times organizations will end up in a heavy meeting culture where they just have meetings for the sake of having meetings. And it becomes very much a check the box exercise. And we don't want that to happen. So that's why the third component, psychological safety, is absolutely essential to healthy and thriving cultures, because then those meetings become purposeful. So what we mean by psychological safety is the belief that team members won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with their ideas, their questions, their concerns, or their mistakes. And that one's really important because I'm sure as coaches, we are all familiar with a growth mindset where we can view failure as an opportunity for learning. And it's a telltale sign of a healthy culture when people are free to make mistakes and the team can band together and use that as a learning opportunity with which to springboard going forward, instead of making it this secrecy around failure because they're afraid of retaliation or discipline of some kind. So the growth mindset and feeling safe to make mistakes is a really key component of psychological safety. And like we said, culture shapes behavior. So when people feel comfortable, they're more likely to be engaged in a meeting and they're going to speak up and share. On the other hand, if people feel psychologically unsafe, there's a big risk to that because they might feel unheard, or they present an idea and it gets shut down or cast aside. And then what happens? They start not caring as much. They stop trying so hard. They may even go as far as to undermine the organizational leadership or go against the organization's objectives. So quiet quitting is something that we hear about a lot. That can happen when the psychological safety is not there. And we'll talk a little bit more about toxic cultures in a bit. But psychological safety is really, really important to create a sense of belonging and help people feel welcome for all of who they are, not just their perfect, presentable side. So, thriving, growing, and winning. This is what we see when there is a healthy culture. You can really create the triple win that Bari talked about at the beginning, where you've got the shared purpose, you have that sense of connection, and you have the psychological safety. And as a result, your employees are happier and more engaged, your customers are more likely to be satisfied, and the company can create bottom line results that are really impactful. So we really, really believe in the importance of helping companies cultivate and maintain healthy cultures.
And before I go through this next piece, I noticed that Greg put a note in the chat, which I think is very interesting. When the culture defines itself, it's usually not a very good one. And just to add to that, sometimes the culture does define itself, and it's not a very good one either. So we have both that we've seen. But again, that's the choice that you get to make, whether you let it ride or you design it by intention.
Definitely.
So some questions that we threw up here that we'd like you to think about as we go through this next piece are, when do things go awry? How do you know if a team culture is in trouble? What's the impact to the team and even the organization? And again, I think many of us come to coaching from different places that we've been. Either we've left the corporate world because there were different things that were going on that perhaps we didn't care for. Perhaps we truly are an entrepreneur and we want to have our own business. And oftentimes we just kind of land here for it's the next phase of life. But in working with teams, for most of us, unless you're very, very young and haven't noticed it, you've noticed things along the way about culture that you maybe didn't realize were part of the culture. And so again, I invite you to think about some of these things, and we'll go back to them after the next piece of this presentation. So, toxic cultures, the opposite of a healthy culture. We have the book, The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle, which really laid out a lot of the foundation that people now have come to know about culture. There's several other books that have been written about culture, and there's many articles that are available to you when you start, doing some searches. And then again, just any of the work that you've done with companies, sometimes you've been called in for whatever reason, or you've been called in to work with individuals, and you'll hear about things that are all part of the culture. So some of the things that we wanted to highlight, which we found were there's too much focus on skills and titles and not enough on the interpersonal interactions between team members. I'm sure I know Shannon and I have worked with some teams that they aren't communicating well, or they don't really understand the shared purpose. And so understanding what you need to go back to when you see some of this toxic behavior within an organization is really important. The blame culture that lacks a sense of belonging, it is, if you go through life just observing people, it is so prevalent to blame others, blame circumstances. And if we all start owning our piece of whatever it is, it changes the conversation. So helping teams to understand what is their role in anything that is going south or going sideways. And then the lack of vulnerability among team members is huge, because if you don't trust the people that you're working with, you may not share some of those things. For me, I think back to some of my corporate experiences where I was managing people and really started to notice how some people, we've all met the people that say yes to everything. And then all of a sudden one day it's like, whoa, why didn't you tell me about this? Why didn't you tell me about that? And so it's really important that people feel psychological safety to be able to share what's going on. And on the other side of that, as leaders, it's really important, and coaches, to point out when somebody doesn't feel safe in sharing what's going on, like what are the risks and the rewards that are being shown in the organization. Like many companies, they have rules, and the rules might be a little bit tight. And so you don't allow employees to be empowered or teams to be empowered to make the choices that are going to help them make better decisions. So again, there's so many pieces that go into the toxic culture, and just kind of understanding them, what it creates. It creates a lot of turnover. It makes it hard to recruit new people. Sometimes values are not they're on the wall. We all know those values that are on the wall. And then we watch what people are doing and the values are not lived. Sometimes there's outside influences like global events. COVID's a perfect example of what went on. And so understanding, they say that COVID was an accelerator to all that now we're starting to experience, because for many years, businesses did not believe that they could change or do some of the things that today they found out they can do. And so the more that they pay attention to what works versus what doesn't work, they give themselves the opportunity to create a better culture. The Great Resignation and all of the turnover that's going on, most of it comes from toxic cultures that people have realized they're not willing to endure anymore. And so companies are scrambling to bring in coaches to help create the stability that they need to create an intentional culture and be able to move forward. So again, I would love you to put in the chat any of the things that you noticed, because we learned from all of you as well. And we'd love to know if you've seen anything. And also if you've seen other cultures, either something different than intentional or default. We'd love to hear that in here. Just take a moment to do that, share. And I see, I'm reading some of the comments in the chat. Yeah, Shakti mentioned that sometimes the concept and the culture was created by people that maybe they're not even there anymore. Rules that came up from way back, you have to pay attention to those. Yeah. And I saw Shannon's response in there. So there are many different things that can cause a culture to go sideways.
Yeah, Greg shared that things can go awry when vulnerability trust is broken. It's absolutely true. When people feel like, I recently was coaching a client who has a guy who went out on paternity leave. And while his employee was out on paternity leave, the project that he had created from inception, there was a decision made to offload it to a different team. And when he came back, he was very bothered by that decision, that he hadn't been involved in it. And it put the team leader in a position where he felt like, we had to make the decision for the business while you were gone. But then that employee sat down with him and said, I don't trust you anymore because you've made a decision that directly impacts me in a negative way. And that incident, just one incident like that, has a ripple effect, because then it impacts how that one employee shows up to the team meetings. He's been off camera, he's been less engaged, he's not putting in the effort anymore. And so they're at a point now where they're trying to rebuild that trust, because it can be a long slog once it's broken, as we all know. Great.
And there's a quote out there, which I'm not gonna do it right, but it's something to the effect that it takes a long time to build up the trust, and it takes only one incident to totally destroy that trust. And so as leaders and as coaches, we would encourage you to really make sure that people understand the value of trust and what they are dealing with, so that they really keep it as a sacred thing within an organization. So one of the things that comes out of cultures is stories, and every organization has the opportunity to tell the story that they want to tell by their actions in it, and whether they're in alignment with what they say they value or whether they are not in alignment. Zappos is one of the first companies that everybody started noticing for culture. And with Zappos, their founder had a different business that he had sold. And when he started working with Zappos, his main goal was to create something that didn't exist before. And he actually wrote a book about delivering happiness. And his whole mission was delivering happiness, and they just happened to sell shoes. So there's so many interesting stories that have come out of Zappos. And I, for one, when I went to visit Las Vegas, I didn't really care about the gambling. I wanted to go visit Zappos, and I actually did take a tour of Zappos and found it fascinating to see all of what I had read in the book and I had learned about the company in action. And so I think when it becomes a vision and a mission to really create a culture that you are proud of and that really reflects the leadership and the stakeholders around an organization, the possibilities are unlimited for potential in an organization. And so one of the stories that I heard recently was some of the executives from one of the shoe companies came to visit Zappos and the headquarters. And after a night out with the founder or with the owner and just, checking things out, they came back to their hotel and they wanted a pizza. And they actually called the Zappos customer service line and said, do you know where we can get a pizza? And not only did the person give them some answers, but they actually took it upon themselves to order pizzas and have them delivered to the hotel to these people. And the person did that because they were empowered to make those kind of decisions. And when you trust your employees to carry out the culture that you've defined, the solutions they find to challenges are amazing. And so I've always been impressed with the Zappos culture story. But some of the others that we found while we were researching for this, Chewy found an interesting quote about a customer who had contacted them to see if they could return an unopened bag of dog food after their pet died. Not only did Chewy give them a full refund, they told them to donate the food to the shelter and had flowers delivered with the gift note signed by the person that this customer had talked to. And so these are just like some little examples of how you create the stories that you want people to tell about your organization. You know, in many companies spend a lot of money advertising, and you watch the ads that they post, and sometimes you think, well, gee, is that really the company that I go to do business with? And so these stories are so much more powerful than anything else. And we've always shared that you have the power to create the story that you want to be told. Customers will give you opportunities, clients will give you opportunities to decide where do you want the story to go. And oftentimes, if the employees don't have what they need to have this feel comfortable and to be psychologically safe and really understand the big purpose of the organization, they will not make the choices that create these positive stories. Some other companies that come to mind are Amazon and Uber. And both of those organizations are very successful in results, but the relationships don't necessarily take a front seat in that process. And it's very important that there is a balance between results and relationships, and defining the culture and creating the values that are lived helps you to create that balance. It's also important to have a balance between the rules and the risks. And so each company gets to decide what that balance is, or it creates itself. And so these are the things that we really have to be careful of. And this is an example where Amazon has created a culture, and I believe Uber also. It's intentional, but it focuses more on the things that aren't long-term sustainable, that may result in high turnover, may result in having difficulty, recruiting new people. So again, you can define a culture and you can create what you want, but you have to make sure it's what you really want or what's going to be the best for the entity in the long run. Do you have any stories to add here, Shannon?
Well, I was just going to double up on Zappos. If you're a reader and you're interested, one of the first books I ever read that really opened my eyes to what the power of organizational culture really is was written about Zappos delivering happiness. So if you're interested in another culture storybook, that one's a great one. Sadly, Zappos did not have a very happy ending because Tony Hsieh passed away, but what he created and his legacy is very powerful at Zappos. And one thing I did want to add here is that so often when people talk about culture, think about culture, they assume that it's the, foosball tables and the summer Fridays and the kombucha on tap at the office. And those are all just perks that are offered. But what we really mean is kind of how Bari illustrated in these stories. It's how decisions are made, how empowered are the people to make a customer happy and to go the distance when it really counts, instead of being bogged down by rules and regulations. And I believe Bari said this, but each company really has the agency over creating their culture. And it's as long as you're going in open-eyed to what that culture is, whether you're a coach or a prospective employee, you know what you're getting yourself into, because not every culture is going to work for everybody. And that's okay. We value the diversity of different types of cultures. So if you guys have any success stories with cultures, like if you wanted to give a company a gold star for their culture, feel free to put that in the chat. I see Greg added a couple here. Yeah, In-N-Out Burger and Pike's Fish Market. I don't specifically know a lot about their cultures, but Greg, if you want to chime in also in the chat about what you find really valuable or star worthy of those cultures, we'd be happy to hear it. All right. So one of the things that we thought would be a nice value add is giving you as coaches a sense of, what might it look like if a company were to, you wake up tomorrow and you have an email from your dream company and they say, "Dear coach, we want you to come in and lead a team coaching engagement." So we put together this high-level step-by-step process to get you started. That's the intention behind this. And you'll see that it's broken out between the culture audit and then progress. So let's go through what the steps are in a culture audit. And what it really starts with is buy-in. So making sure that you have both leadership's buy-in as well as the employees, because impact matters to everybody in a company, and you want to make sure that everybody is on board with the change, because if people don't feel heard, they will be highly resistant to change and they likely won't embrace it. So buy-in is kind of the first point. Then we want to establish that shared purpose behind a potential culture coaching engagement. So getting clear on what the underlying why is so that there's a clear purpose behind the engagement. And kind of finding out here, what is it that will be different when the culture change takes place, which can also be illuminated through an evaluation of what's working with the current culture or what needs to change. Because sometimes, like Shakti was mentioning, rules and regulations get established or culture gets established by one leader, and then 3 turnovers later, we're still operating under that old cultural system. So likely there are components that are working, and then there are probably things that are not working, hence why they called you in for this engagement as a coach. And then the other piece of that culture audit is looking at a values assessment. And we've brought up the word values a couple of different times. The key takeaway with values is, as a coach, being able to be that third-party observer who comes into a team and is able to say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that transparency is really important to you. And yet what I'm seeing play out here is that when people are transparent on the team, there is a repercussion where it's not really, their feedback is not really embraced. So help me understand the disconnect, or help me connect the dots between that. Your job is to be able to be that observer who can point out patterns and discrepancies between what they say is important, the espoused or spoken values, versus what's actually getting lived out among the team. And often it's in that discrepancy where the true opportunity lies to be able to get them back aligned and moving in that same direction. So that's the culture audit piece. And then we have progress as sort of the second part of a coaching engagement for a team culture. And with progress, you want to make sure that you have that shared definition of what progress is going to look like. What kind of changes can we expect to see? Why do those changes matter in the first place, right? We're going deeper and deeper to continue asking those open-ended questions so that we can really get to the heart of the matter. And then you want to talk about how it will be measured, which involves maybe, how do we want to measure these changes? And how do we want to really be able to look at what the ROI of a culture change is? Sometimes that can be done in an employee engagement survey. Other times it can be done through more qualitative conversations. The format is really up to you to decide throughout this entire process what works best within that organization. And we find that a combination typically works best of surveys as an initial step, then being able to do focus groups on the results of that survey so that everybody feels heard, and then one-on-one conversations for people who may not be as comfortable opening up in a group dynamic. So this is the process that we've laid out, and a few tips off to the side there. You want to be curious, listen, and follow those intuitive hits, like we said, about being the third party observer, and seek first to understand, as Bari reminds me often. Yes, Greg's giving us a thumbs up on that, because ultimately, as the coach, you're partnering with this organization. And what that means is you're not there to give them advice. You're really there to hold space to allow them to speak up and have these important conversations that often get so overlooked by the busyness of the regular workday, but can be the real game changer that help them up-level their results. So if you can partner with them and then in some ways be unattached to the outcome, which we can all probably, I see some smiles here about how challenging that can be, but the organization itself has to really be invested, because when that coaching engagement ends or that coaching session time is up, they have to be the ones that can go out there and action on the changes that they say they want to make. Anything else to add on this, Bari?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is, even once you define a culture and create an intentional culture, it's important to go through the audit process and the progress process continually, because, things change and you have to be agile and you have to be constantly evolving. And so that's what I just, it's not a one and done kind of thing. It's something that you keep doing. And no matter what type of coaching you're doing within an organization, when you're working with teams, you can always check in to see what their culture, take a temperature on their culture. And that's always worked that, every time somebody changes on a team, every time you have a new leader in charge, those things, like Shakti pointed out, sometimes it's just because this is the way we do things. And it takes a coach asking the questions and helping them to really, the team members or the leader, to really stop and think, what is behind this? What do we really need here? Was this designed in a time when we didn't have whatever it is, and now we do have that? So what do we need to evolve here? So that's the only thing I would just add to it. It's a continuous process to keep moving up in being a great company and seeing the unlimited possibilities of the potential of every organization when leadership is in it for all.
Definitely. And that's important for everyone to remember as coaches, that a company may not approach you about doing a year-long engagement, let's say, but what we've found is when you can create that longer container within which you are working with a company, it allows you to ebb and flow as the company either scales up or retracts, depending on what's happening in their business environment. And you really have the ability to add value over a longer term. And that helps you also create that financial security and stability while giving them value over a longer period of time. So the refinement piece is really great. Thank you for adding that, Barry.
So we're at that point where we want to know what questions you have, and feel free to unmute or raise your hand, and we'd love to be able to answer whatever questions you have.
And while we're letting people come up with their questions, I'll just put this slide up, which has our contact information. So if there was a book that we mentioned, or you're a podcast person, Bari is the podcast wizard. She has all the great podcast recommendations about culture. So feel free to send us a note if you would like information on additional resources that we find really helpful. Okay, Greg shared a question, which is, when do you know when it is time to revisit your culture and possibly changing the language? Oh, such a good question. I think most companies realize it's time once things have already gone awry or sideways. And the reality is we'd love for them to be able to see it before it's coming, which I think brings up a good point about the importance of relationships and cultivating those relationships with people that you meet at networking events or through other means. You always want to be staying in touch with them, which I think is one of Bari's best gifts, is she's so good at that relationship piece, because then they want to hear from you and they'll reach out potentially, or you'll help them see something before it's gone awry, and you can help them proactively as opposed to reactively work on their culture. And Greg says he believes it should be visited on a regular basis. Yes, that's absolutely it. And then the question is, how do we help more companies understand that, right? That's the power of relationships.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's a huge opportunity going forward, because with some of these companies doing major layoffs right now, it is an opportunity for us as coaches to notice things and perhaps use the resources we have to make connections with people that maybe work within these organizations, to be able to say, what would be helpful to you, and just sharing some little thing. And those questions that we asked about the toxic culture, take those to heart and really notice, like just in your everyday, transactions, etc., where you come into contact with people that may need your services, and create the awareness for them of whatever it is you see, to help them see that they need you.
Yeah, I would say one of the most common things we see is back to the company perks that are offered. And so often companies will come to us and say, well, we offered this, leadership training, or we offered this other kind of learning and development opportunity, or we offered a happy hour, and we thought that was the culture that we needed to give our people. But if you really think about it, people are pressed for time. They're already trying to cram so much into a workday. And really those extras that you're asking people or inviting people to join, that might take them away from family time, or time that they're developing a hobby, or just running errands, like going to a doctor's appointment. So we help companies see that culture is about so much more than those perks. And it's really more these fundamentals of how people are communicating with each other and what their level of self-awareness is, which is really the beauty of coaching. Yeah, Shakti, what's your question?
I have actually not been in the corporate world since right after COVID. And I'm hopeful to not actually necessarily go back to it, I will admit right here. But one thing that I noticed certainly before was that very often this toxicity and a lot of these problems are already in existence within an organization, when in the past, having a coach come in for individuals or for some other purpose was often a way to check the box. And this is, again, I'm speaking from my personal experience. It's probably not true all over the place, but I saw it in several organizations that I was in, where it was a way to check the box that, oh, well, we supported you as an employee or as a person who feels like you need whatever it is you need. There wasn't really a commitment to bringing a real change, because people just felt okay to go through the cycles of, okay, she'll just quit, or we'll just fire her, or whatever, and we'll find a better person because there's a better person out there. And it is the person who wasn't maybe a good fit. I know I'm making a lot of assumptions there, but what are you finding now as to how that might have shifted, or is that different? I'm curious just what your perspective is on this in the business and corporate world today.
I was just going to throw out there that I think a lot of businesses are dealing with new teams, with a lot of change within the team dynamics, etc. And so those that value what can happen when they try things differently and go outside and bring in experts such as coaches, etc., see the opportunities. And again, this is part of how do you assess a culture. But I think that there's going to be a lot more of these changes going on. And so, just the opportunity to ask these questions, and, for all of us that have left the corporate world for whatever reason, to understand what drove you out and what would you like to see change, because that's the opportunity there. You now are on the other side, coaching and what it can do. And it's the opportunity to help companies be more intentional about the culture they're creating and create more companies that make it to the great list, as opposed to making it to the toxic list.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answers it, but yeah.
What I would add is that it really depends on the accountability from the execution standpoint, right? So we talked about values and what they say is important versus what's actually lived out in the organization. So Shakti, I think you having that perspective, as Bari is saying, about what you experience, I always say that contrast is one of the best teachers. So given that you experienced something that didn't really work for you, or that made you feel, less valued and appreciated, or something like that, it gives you the opportunity to then be able to help a client see what the impact of their potential culture changes or the existing culture has on their people. And you can take it further by saying, and how are you going to hold people accountable to playing out these values? Because it's one thing to say it and put it on, a chalkboard or a memo, but it's a whole nother thing to actually play that out and look at what behaviors are being rewarded and what behaviors are being punished. So often I think companies now are offering something like unlimited PTO, and that's the perk that they sell people on before they come into the company. But then what often happens is if you take that unlimited PTO, you'll notice that you're not ascending in the corporate ladder as quickly as you would like to, or as quickly as your colleagues who aren't taking that unlimited PTO. And so that sends a message, because the behavior that's being rewarded is, yeah, we offer this perk, but if you want to advance your career, you better not take us up on that perk, because we won't move you up. So it's a real opportunity for coaches to come in and help them look at what behaviors are connected to the cultural values and components.
And just to add to what Shannon just said, it can also create resentment among other people on the team, because if people are not accountable and they're taking their PTO and leaving people holding the bag, it can create exactly what you don't want to create. So again, watching what happens when you change something or do something and really paying attention. Is it working? Is it helping you get closer to where you want to go, or is it taking you away from where you want to go? And on that note, I noticed the time. So if anybody would like to continue the conversation or has questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. And thank you all for coming today. This has been great.
I had a question, but I will leave to talk to both of you in another moment, because
I'm okay. I can stay on. It's just I didn't know if you needed to,
Move on to the next workshop.
Yeah.
We could talk culture all day long, truly.
Misha, I think Misha wants to say something.
Yes, I want to jump in and say great job. I'm glad I jumped into this session, got some nuggets from you guys. I was in the moment doing a little audit for ICF South Florida chapter as you were talking. So great job, ladies.
Thank you.
And,